Hey friends, you're watching BrainStormAcres. I'm Henry.
And I'm Irene.
We've been home just about 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And during those 2 weeks, we've had a ton of stuff that we've had to get done.
Yes, definitely. 3/4 of which we didn't even record because we'd have never gotten it done.
Well, the big thing is you don't want to watch us just perspire. We came back to 100-degree weather. It dropped down into the upper 90s and it bounced right back up again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's about 8 o'clock at night now, and it is still over 80 degrees. And we're high altitude, so it's supposed to cool down at night.
Maybe, we'll see.
It probably will, but it's cooling down late, which is problematic.
We had some rain while we were gone.
Yes, we did. We're estimating, 4 or 5 inches of rain.
That's quite a bit of rain for us.
Right.
In 1 month.
Right. It's that time of year.
Monsoon rains are a little different than the rains that you get, let's say, in the East Coast or in the central United States or the southern states.
Mm-hmm.
In the desert, you can get some real interesting water movement.
Well, the worst we've ever seen here is 4 inches of rain in an hour. A little bit less than an hour.
Yeah, normally we might get 2 inches in half an hour or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And that's usually the extent of a monsoon. But a bad year, well, it depends on good, bad. It depends on whether you're prepared or not. A challenging year is when you get 4 inches in an hour. And we've had seasons when that happened multiple times. Now, when we built this place, we specifically chose to build on the top of a hill. We were fortunate enough we chose an area that had hills. We have, for years and years, driven through areas where you can see the results of flooding. If you are driving down the highway and there is a salt crust on the top of the ground and you can see where the puddles must have evaporated, that area gets what I would call sheet flooding. That means that the area is flat enough that the entire thing will flood, and then the water will gradually recede to the lowest areas, and you'll get salt buildup.
Yeah. Now, how rain behaves on a specific piece of property depends on a lot of things: the terrain, the type of ground you have, the type of ground cover you have. But just as important is how fast that rain comes down. Now, we have friends who live in southern Arizona, and they got 2 to 2.5 inches over a 24-hour period.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing.
They thought that was huge, and I'm like, that's nothing.
Well, when you get 2 or 2.5 inches in half an hour or 20 minutes, that's a whole different set of hydrology. That is the water movement that goes over your property.
Right.
That's when you have the kind of sheeting that Irene's talking about, and you get erosion. Now, we've been building and rebuilding our driveway for 17 years.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't go exactly where I would like it to go because part of it was already here when we got here, and moving it was going to be a major pain in the neck.
But when we first bought the place, we sank a truck in it a couple of times coming in. And you don't sink a truck in it anymore.
No.
So
an awful lot of that is water management. We have ditches on both sides of the driveway. Unfortunately, there's been eroding going on, but we'll get that fixed. We'll bring in some more rock, and we'll slow the water down. It's still going to be going down the driveway, down those ditches, but we want to slow it down. That will keep it from eroding as fast and as deep as it's been doing recently.
Right. You need to talk to people who've been in an area for a long time.
And you have to listen to them.
Yeah. I've heard from so many people recently, well, if you don't know someone, would you listen to what they had to say?
Yes.
Yeah, sure I would. I would do what I've always done my entire life, even when I was a very small child. If an adult told me something was one way, I always put it kind of like in a file in my head. And then I verified it over time. And I decided that some adults were liars. at a very young age.
Or at least some adults really don't know what they're talking about
Right.
on some specific topics.
But, well, I also decided some adults were liars.
They are.
You know, and not in the joking sense, but they just lied. It is important to listen to people. It is also important to understand what their level of expertise is. I took geology in undergraduate. I have a minor in geology. So I had like 5 or 6 classes in geology. We didn't really discuss, that I remember, a huge amount about things like erosion and stuff. I mean, it was there. As a small child, playing in the backyard, erosion was an obvious thing to me. You poured a bucket of water, the soil washed, and you could control where it washed by the slope of your dirt, how you move the dirt around, things like that. I honestly think that a lot of people who are homesteaders have never played in the mud.
Yeah, you have to play in the mud at some point.
You do, because if you don't, you might wind up with an entire house full of mud.
Now, Irene has a great academic background and practical background of looking at erosion in a normal environment. I built roads. I built roads in Maine. I built roads in New Mexico. I built roads all over the place, including in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California, where there were huge amounts of rain. It was on top of a mountain. Each environment has a different amount of things that you have to deal with. But
Yes.
it can be dealt with. It may not be easy, it may not be obvious, but you do need to pay attention. And for heaven's sake, do pay attention to the people who have been there for a while. And I'm not talking about somebody who's been there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
If you need to look at what the weather patterns is. We are seeing parts of Arizona right now where 90% of the people who live there have been there less than 10 years.
An awful lot
And
less than 5.
75% have been less than 5. Those people can't give you what the history is. Not really, because you can get these little patches of good weather, or what we call the monsoon, where we don't have a monsoon. And suddenly people are going, oh, this is normal. Because we've been here for 3 years, and this is the way it's been every year. 3 years does not a pattern make.
You know, rain and groundwater and flooding kind of brings me to another topic, and that is, how do you engineer foundations? How do you build things in the desert where you're prone to flooding? And the answer is, try to build up. Don't build where it can flood. We have friends, again, in southern Arizona who have built in flood areas. The water rips through like there's no tomorrow, and some of them have decided to build big berms to divert the water away from their property because that's what's required.
Right, well, what I always like to do when I come into an area, whether I'm building there or whether I'm just driving through, is I notice where the houses are that were built, say, in the 1920s.
Or even the late 1800s.
Right. I mean, the older you can get, the better off you are. If everything in the area that you see, if all the older homes were built on top of hills,
there's a good reason for it.
There's a reason for that. When we lived in New Mexico, there was a town named Limitar, down by the Rio Grande.
Still is.
Still there. And we were seeing an influx of city folks coming into that area.
Now, we were young. We were in our very early 20s, relatively new. Well, we were newly
We were
married.
newlyweds.
So we'd go to Limitar and live in Sin.
Right. That was a standard joke in the area. Livingston and Limitar.
But you know, if you look at those old adobe homes that had been there for a long while, they had a really unique feature.
They all had a wall around them. It was about 2 feet tall.
You could swing your leg over it and get over it without a problem.
Yeah, if you were short, you sat on the wall, you swung your legs over, and and that's the way you did it. And people from the city would come and they'd say, oh, this is a pain in the behind. When I'm trying to get the groceries into the house, I have to, do all kinds of things in order to do that.
I'm going to cut a hole in that wall so it's easy to walk in.
Right, I'll put a gate in to keep the goats out and stuff like that, but it'll be fine.
Yeah, it wasn't fine.
No, within a year, their house will be flooded. Because at some point, at any time of the year, because although they suffer from monsoons too, they also got rains and winter rain sometimes. And there would be a flood. And it might be a quick flood, so it might be gone in an hour, but it still could put several inches of water into your house. So if you move to an area and you find that there are absolutely no houses built in the area, you have to ask why.
That's a really important question to ask on a lot of things, and that is why. And if you can't deal with the answer, don't move there.
Yeah. I mean, we've been on the eastern plains of Colorado, which is flat as a board in some areas. And when you come to a house, it will always be built up. Now, I don't know whether they chose the only house in the only hill in the area and built on it, or whether they constructed a hill. My bet is they built a hill.
There's an awful lot of hills that houses were built on that were actually built to build the house on.
Right. And you see that commonly in some areas of the Midwest, too, where it's very flat, and the houses are all built on hills. Now, today, because, of course, that doesn't suit the modern aesthetic of having one house here and one house 5 miles down the road, and we want to have tick, 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 tick houses. Now when they build a subdivision, they do what they did in the Texas subdivision that we lived in. Serious hydroengineering.
Flood control, major league flood control.
Major league, I mean, for all that there were mistakes made in that subdivision, the people who engineered the drainage in there were amazing. When we had hurricanes come through, our subdivision never ever flooded. Now, we were an island. Literally, I remember coming out of without thinking about it, coming out of the front entrance of the subdivision and looking in every direction, and there was nothing but water except for the very center of the crowned road. So driving a four-wheel drive, I drove right down the line and got to the next road. Now the next road over was built higher, but all the areas, all the farmers' fields, everything were under. The church down the street had water 6 inches from the bottom of the door because it too had been built up. But that kind of hydroengineering, I mean, we had 30-foot deep, 30-foot wide.
More than 30 feet.
Ditches. They call them bayous because it sounds so much nicer. They were ditches that were cut behind through the subdivision. And it took the water. It didn't matter how fast it came down. It didn't matter, how much came down. It took it away.
Now, there's one thing that goes along with watching out for water, and that is something that doesn't go with water, and that's electricity.
Yeah. There's reasons that they want you to have waterproof fixtures on the outside of homes. If you have an outlet, we have outlets on the outside of the utility building and the outside of the workshop, outside of the studio. They're waterproof.
Well, one of the problems with doing electrical installations yourself as a homesteader, somebody who's really never done electric before, is you can make a lot of mistakes that are really bad. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you're going to build with adobe or clay-based product that's not fired,
right,
there's a question of, can you bury the Romex, that's the normal wire that goes in the walls, directly into the wall of your adobe structure? And the answer is, it depends where you are, but
yeah.
When it comes to those kinds of things, if you have a failure of the electric wire in your wall, now you have a problem because you have to tear your wall apart in order to fix the problem. There's
a reason that they do walls the way they do, where you create a chase where your things go into, and you can create, I've seen people do straw bales and everything else where they had thought it out ahead of time and their wires were all in chases. And any place that they had to take it outside of that chase, it was put into a conduit so that they couldn't easily puncture anything. And so the conduit was providing safety, basically.
There's a lot of safety issues when it comes to electrical systems, especially off-grid electrical systems. You have to have the earth ground for your basic system, but there's other kinds of grounding issues going on. And I see an awful lot of people doing questionable things.
Well, let me put it this way. I'm not going to run over to their house and flip the switch. Especially not during a rainstorm.
Well, for that matter, any time.
Really. One of the things that Henry and I were talking about earlier today was the problem of resale property. Okay, we meet every building code that is currently in use in this county.
Yeah, when we first started building our homestead 17 years ago, Yavapai County had an opt-out option for owner builders.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of counties have done away with that for a lot of reasons. Some counties still have that option, but one of the things that you have to really be concerned about is, are you going to live forever? Are your kids or your grandkids or your nephews or nieces going to want to live in this place that you spent hours and hours building and taking care of? The question is, if you cease to exist tomorrow, what's going to happen to this place that you built?
There was discussion on the Facebook list that I'm on about why things are the way they are at a particular meeting location. And someone commented that the reason this law exists, this rule exists, probably should have somebody's name associated with it.
And it does.
Yes, we just don't know what the name is. But the reason these names get made is because of disasters that are caused by individual people, and the laws are then put into place to try and avert future disaster. We have a friend in Williams area who his mom bought them a house to live in. She got a tremendous deal on it because, and this is very, very typical in the area we live in, elderly parents, they died. Kids do not want to live there. They live in suburbia where they have a good job and a good house and a good car and a good cat and dog and 2.54 kids. You know?
Yeah, they like living in the city.
Well, whether they like it or not, that's where their jobs are. So they may like to vacation in the country, but they're not willing to deal with mom and pop's old place. And that was a decent place. That was a manufactured home. They had to dump that. Basically, they took everything out that they wanted, all the memorabilia and stuff, and they left the rest and told somebody to sell it for whatever they could get for it.
And it sold really cheap.
Now, that was great for our friends because they were able to get a great house, which then they cleaned up and did nicer things with. But if you have built an alternative structure, you have instantly, and even if it's a by code alternative structure, say you do a straw bale build and you meet all the code things for it, because there are codes in the different counties for structural stability and all that kind of stuff, electricity, what your sewage is doing, how your water system's set up. Okay, you meet all the codes. You have still instantly contracted dramatically what your market is, because a lot of the public is simply going to not want an alternative building method. Okay, that's acceptable. I mean, I have seen some alternative building method places up in the Tahoe area, in New Mexico and stuff like that are just beyond gorgeous. They're the big earth chips and things like that. They're beautiful. But not everybody's going to want one of those.
Will this technique that I'm using, even though it's perfectly acceptable to me, be acceptable to somebody else?
Right.
And I'm not saying don't use that technique. I'm just saying think about it.
Think about it.
One of the things that you can do is, let's suppose you're going to use human manure, which is perfectly fine. We don't have an issue with that. But if you're going to be in a flood zone or flooding area, you want to make sure that that material is
Built
up, so that it couldn't be carried downstream. Because I can tell you there are places out here where some people have a few septic issues, and when it rains,
people downstream get all the septic.
So
not cool.
Think about it, and think about your neighbors, think about the future and what you would do.
The most common reason for people leaving in our area is because one or both of the members of a couple become ill and now need to live closer to good medical facilities. In our area, if you have a male and a female living together and the female dies, probably 75% of the time or more, the male will stay. If you have a male and a female living together and the male dies,
most of the time,
I would say 80% of the time, maybe more, the female leaves.
And most of them leave certainly within a year or two.
It's too hard. It's too hard to be by yourself. And if you are older, particularly, which is usually when this occurs, all of a sudden you have to manage all the systems that the two of you together managed before. Think about what happens if you drop dead and your other half suddenly has to try and sell a place that is a hazmat situation.
Or whether it's actually hazmat or not is kind of irrelevant. If you're using some alternative methods, it may be
Is a
objectionable.
bank going to give a loan on the property? That's the question you need to ask.
So we got to say goodbye, Irene.
So just think about it. Think about not just the cool things you're doing now, but will those things be cool in 10, 20, 30 years when one of you has to sell?
Whether it's a spouse, a partner, a friend, a shared environment,
Right.
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't. You have to think about the people left behind, basically. Because you might be creating a nightmare where you'd actually literally have to walk away and let it go for taxes, and you don't want to have that happen.
So,
you want to be able to get some money out of there, so you got someplace to go.
say goodnight, Irene.
So, I know this wasn't the cheeriest thing in the world, but it's a serious consideration. We're seeing some disasters happen out there that don't need to happen. So, if people think it out ahead of time, they can avoid a lot of the problems. So, until next time, be sure to like and subscribe, hit that notification bell, because we're going to do lots and lots of stuff. We've got all kinds of things in the works right now.
Too many things.
Too many things. We joke about the list being longer than your arm right now. So, until next time, bye.
Bye. Keep brainstorming. We have to.
Oh gosh, yes, we have to.